At 12:17 a.m., Claire Donnelly lifted a ribbon of black paint no wider than a fingernail and found her dead father underneath it. Not his face, his initials, J.D., scratched into the original gesso beneath a layer that should have been untouched for nearly 40 years. Claire stopped breathing. The Belandi portrait lay beneath cold conservation lights, a 6-foot canvas of a dark-haired woman in ivory silk. Official records said it had never left private family storage. Claire's father had never worked for the Belandis. He had died disgraced after being blamed for a museum theft that destroyed his name and hollowed out hers. So why was his mark buried inside this painting? And why had someone covered it with fresh pigment less than a month ago? The lock clicked behind her. Claire turned. Luca Belandi stood inside the conservation room in a charcoal suit, damp from the rain, one hand still on the door. "Don't touch anything else until I tell you." Claire looked back at the initials. "You hired the wrong conservator if you wanted obedience." His expression didn't change. "Someone accessed your private report 43 minutes ago." That got her attention. Luca crossed the room and placed a phone beside her microscope. On the screen was a security log from the encrypted archive she had used that afternoon. Her report had been opened from an internal Belandi terminal. Claire's stomach tightened. Which one was it? "If I knew, we wouldn't be having this conversation." He looked at the portrait. "What did you find?" Claire covered the initials with neutral tissue. "Something I'm not discussing until I know who read my notes." A faint muscle moved in his cheek. Most people treated Luca Belandi's silence like a warning. Claire had spent 14 years telling wealthy collectors that money did not change chemistry or make a forged signature real. Intimidation was simply another contaminant. Luca stepped closer. "Tomorrow night, this painting goes to the Calder House preview. People who would pay very well to know why I hired a forensic conservator 72 hours before an auction will be there." "You didn't hire me for an auction." "No. You hired me because you thought someone altered it." His eyes sharpened. Luca lowered his voice. "Until I know who accessed your report, no one can know what you are doing for me." "And how do you explain why I'm standing beside you all night?" "I already did." Claire waited. "You're my fiancé." For the first time that night, Claire nearly dropped a tool. 3 days earlier, she had been in her own laboratory arguing with a collector who wanted her to certify a 19th-century landscape painted in 1986. That had been normal. The Belandi Commission was not. She had accepted it because of a photograph. 20 years ago, her father, James Donnelly, had been chief night supervisor at the Marlow Museum when Renaissance drawings disappeared from secured storage. The cameras failed. A service door opened under his credentials. One stolen frame was found in his car. He swore he had been set up. Nobody believed him. He died 6 years later with the word thief still attached to his name. Then Luca's office sent Claire an old provenance photograph of the Belandi portrait. In the background stood her father. 3 days before the theft. That was why Claire had taken the job. The chance to learn why James Donnelly had been standing beside a painting that supposedly never entered the Marlow Museum. The photograph had bothered Claire from the moment she saw it. Her father was not looking at the camera. He was looking at Luca's mother, Elena Belandi, who stood beside the portrait with one hand pressed against the frame. James looked tense. Elena looked afraid. On the back, someone had written a date in blue ink and nothing else. Claire had asked Luca where the photograph came from. "A box my mother kept locked," he had said. "What else was in it?" "Nothing you need." That answer had nearly made her walk away. Instead, she had taken the commission because 20 years of official reports had given her certainty without truth, and she was tired of certainty. Now someone inside Luca's organization had opened the report where she had written, "Possible undocumented intervention, circa 20 years ago." Claire removed her gloves. "I am not pretending to marry you. It's one evening." That sentence has ruined entire bloodlines. Something almost human flickered across Luca's face. "You want every provenance record my family has." "Yes." "You want my mother's storage ledgers." "Yes." "You want to know why your father appears in a photograph my family claims does not exist?" Claire went still. "I can give you all of it," Luca said, "but tomorrow you stay beside me." "And if I say no?" "Then I move you somewhere secure anyway, because whoever opened your report knows you found something." She hated how calmly he said it. Claire turned back to the painting. Under magnification, the exposed section told a clear story. Original chalk ground, aged oil binder, old repair adhesive. Then a glossy modern black containing metallic shimmer that did not belong. She changed lenses. Metallic mica. Luca looked at her. "It's suspended in a modern synthetic binder. Whoever covered my father's initials did this recently." "How recently?" 3 to 5 weeks. She placed a microscopic flake under the portable spectrometer. The machine hummed, then produced a manufacturer code. Claire stared. "Calder House." Luca's head turned. "They use this exact archival black for temporary auction repairs. Proprietary stock. I've seen it in their conservation lab." Tomorrow night's preview was being held at Calder House. Someone connected to the auction had altered the portrait before Luca brought it to Claire. Someone inside Luca's organization had accessed her report. Luca reached for the tissue covering James Donnelly's initials. Claire caught his wrist. "Don't." His gaze dropped to her hand. "If those initials are original to the intervention, touching that surface could destroy the edge pattern. You want answers? Stop treating evidence like it works for you." Silence. Then Luca stepped back. "Fine." Claire noticed the concession. She returned to the canvas and angled a narrow inspection light along the lower stretcher bar. A line appeared in the backing paper. Not a tear, a cut. The paper had been sliced open and resealed with recent conservation adhesive. "Luca." He heard the change in her voice immediately. Claire slid a micro spatula beneath the seam. The backing lifted. Inside the narrow space between canvas and stretcher was nothing. Only 4 rectangular pressure marks where something had rested for years. Someone had opened the portrait before it reached her. Whatever had been hidden inside was already gone. Luca's phone vibrated. He read the message once, and every trace of restraint disappeared from his face. "What happened?" He turned the screen toward her. A still image from the hallway camera showed a man in a maintenance uniform leaving Claire's temporary lab 40 minutes earlier. He carried a thin, gray notebook. Claire recognized it instantly. Her handwritten conservation log, the one containing measurements, pigment observations, and a photograph of her father's initials. Luca was already moving. "Pack what you need." "For where?" "My house." "No. Your apartment address was in that notebook." The argument died before it reached her mouth. Luca picked up the portrait's transport cover. "From this moment on, the painting goes where you go." Claire stared at the empty cavity in the frame, then at her father's initials beneath the tissue. An hour ago she had been authenticating a painting. Now someone had stolen proof connecting her father to it. Something had already been removed from inside the canvas, and Luca Bellondi had just made her part of his security problem. Luca opened the door. "And Claire?" She looked at him. "Tomorrow night. Try to look like you like me." Claire took one last glance at the initials. "For the record, that will be the least believable part." Claire discovered the first lie in Luca Bellondi's house before breakfast. The portrait had been moved into a windowless second-floor study with armed men outside. Luca had also installed a chair 6 feet behind Claire's work table. He was sitting in it. Claire lowered her magnifying visor. "You're breathing on my varnish." "I'm 20 feet away." "Emotionally, you're breathing on it." Luca looked up from his phone. "You said you needed security." "I said the painting needed security. I did not request a 6'3" surveillance system in Italian wool." His mouth twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen since arriving at the townhouse before dawn. Claire returned to the backing paper. Under angled light, the resealed cut was even more obvious here. Whoever had opened the frame knew enough to avoid damaging the canvas, but not enough to fool a conservator. She inserted a fiber probe beneath the edge. A fragment of oxidized steel caught the light. "Staple." Luca came closer. Claire held up a hand. He stopped. That, more than anything, surprised her. She removed the staple fragment with tweezers and placed it beneath the microscope. The crown was narrow, the legs hand-filed. Blue resin clung to one side. Claire knew it. Not from a textbook, from childhood. Her father used to complain about it at the kitchen table, picking dried blue flecks from his fingernails after late museum shifts. "Marlowe workshop stock," she said. Luca's expression hardened. "You're sure?" "My father's restoration department used blue-tinted reversible resin for temporary framing repairs. They stopped after 2007 because it yellowed under heat." She rotated the fragment. "This was installed before then. So your father opened the frame. Or someone using his workshop did." Claire refused to let hope outrun evidence. She checked the lower stretcher, then found 2 more old staple holes beneath the recent backing paper. The spacing matched. Behind one hole was the corner of a folded document wedged between wood and canvas. Claire eased it free. The paper was brittle and cream-colored, stamped with a provenance seal from 20 years earlier. Luca read over her shoulder, "Transfer authorization. From the Marlowe Museum to private Bellondi storage." Claire scanned the signatures. One belonged to a museum registrar who had been dead for 11 years. The second made her go still. Gabriel Thorne, Luca's family attorney. Approved 20 years ago. "This says your mother's portrait was inside the Marlowe Museum the week before the theft." Luca took the document but did not touch the ink. "That contradicts every family inventory. And every museum record." Claire looked at him. "Someone erased its visit from both sides." By 6 that evening, the forged fiancé had acquired a diamond ring, an ivory evening dress, and a headache. Calder House occupied a converted bank downtown, all marble columns and discreet cameras. The preview floor glowed beneath museum lighting, filled with collectors accustomed to being obeyed. Luca's hand rested at Claire's waist, too naturally. She hated that she noticed. "Smile," he murmured. "You first." "I am smiling." "You look like you're deciding where to bury someone." "That is my relaxed face." Claire almost laughed. Then she saw the painting. Displayed beneath a brass plaque at the far end of the gallery, Elena Bellondi stared out from the canvas exactly as she had that morning. Except she didn't. Claire stopped walking. Luca felt it immediately. What? Don't look alarmed. I never look alarmed. Congratulations. Keep doing that. They continued forward as if discussing champagne. Claire watched the portrait from 20 feet away. The crack pattern was wrong. Old oil paint contracts in irregular networks shaped by ground, humidity, and age. Claire had spent hours mapping those cracks around Elena Belandi's left shoulder. The painting in front of her had beautiful cracks. Too beautiful. Artificially aged. A duplicate. Someone had switched the canvas. Luca's fingers tightened against her waist. Tell me, that isn't your mother's portrait. He turned his head a fraction. Claire dug her nails into his wrist. Do not react. His body went very still. Where is the real one? With your security team, unless they switched it before transport. Luca was already scanning exits. Claire leaned closer, making the movement look intimate. If the thief believes the fake is still undetected, we have an advantage. I can shut the building down in 30 seconds. And whoever arranged this disappears in 20. His eyes found hers. This was the moment she had expected to lose. Luca solved problems by taking control, closing doors, moving men, removing choices. Instead, he asked, "What do you need?" Claire answered immediately, 5 minutes. A gray-haired bidder approached before Luca could reply. Belandi. The man's smile was warm enough to be insulting. Marcus Vale, Luca said. Claire recognized the name from the files Luca had finally given her that afternoon. Vale financed shipping competitors along the Eastern Corridor and had spent 3 years trying to buy property around Belandi docks. His gaze settled on Claire's ring. So the rumors are true. Most rumors are boring, Luca replied. Vale extended a hand to Claire. She took it. Claire Donnelly. I know. That single sentence landed badly. Claire smiled. Then you have an unfair advantage. I make it a habit to know what interests Luca. Vale glanced toward the portrait. Beautiful piece. Your future mother-in-law, I believe. Claire followed his gaze and saw something that confirmed her suspicion. The black restoration line near the lower frame was perfectly smooth. The original contained the tiny nick she had created while sampling the modern pigment. This one did not. She squeezed Luca's hand twice, their agreed signal from the car. He understood. Vale continued talking. Luca did not look at the exits. He did not summon security. He stood beside Claire and played the role she needed him to play. That was new. 10 minutes later, Belandi security confirmed the genuine portrait was still sealed inside the armored transport case downstairs, which meant the duplicate had been prepared before tonight. Someone expected the real painting to arrive and wanted it substituted inside Calder House. Claire asked to examine the fake privately. The auction director objected. Luca looked at him once. They were given a room. Under ultraviolet light, the copy revealed a fluorescent underdrawing beneath Elena Belandi's dress. Not decorative sketching. Numbers. Claire wrote them down. 204, 205, 206, 17B. Luca watched over her shoulder. Do they mean anything? Not yet. Then Claire reached the final sequence. She stopped. 9C44 South. Luca's face changed. Claire looked at him. You know that one. He closed the room door. That's a transport route. Historical? Tonight. Claire felt the entire mystery shift beneath her feet. What is moving? medical equipment officially. And unofficially? Luca did not answer. He didn't need to. Claire stared at the fluorescent numbers again. The first 3 sequences resembled museum inventory codes. The last belonged to Luca's current operations. Someone had embedded the present inside a copy of a decades-old painting. Who knows this route? 4 people. Names. Luca's silence returned. Claire turned toward him. No, we are past this. His gaze stayed on the numbers. Gabriel Thorne, my security chief Matteo, my operations director Rosa, and me. Claire thought of the brittle transfer authorization hidden in the real frame. Gabriel Thorne's signature, 20 years old. She thought of the report breach, the fresh black pigment, the missing object inside the portrait. Then she remembered something else. That afternoon, Gabriel had visited the townhouse for 15 minutes. He had stood in the doorway of the study and looked at the portrait. Strange, he had said casually. I always thought the blue beneath Elena's sleeve made her look ill. Claire had said nothing at the time. She had never mentioned blue underpainting to him. It was not in her report. It was visible only under ultraviolet examination. Claire looked at Luca. How would Gabriel know there's blue beneath your mother's sleeve? For the first time since she had met him, Luca Bellondi had no immediate answer. Luca did not question Gabriel that night. That frightened Claire more than anger would have. He simply stood beneath the ultraviolet lamp, looking at the fluorescent blue beneath his mother's painted sleeve, then reached for his phone. No calls, Claire said. His eyes lifted. If Gabriel knows something he shouldn't, the fastest way to lose him is to let him know we noticed. Luca's thumb stopped above the screen. For several seconds, the room held the quiet tension of a gun not yet fired. Then he put the phone away. You're asking me to do nothing. I'm asking you to wait. I don't wait well. I noticed. This time the corner of his mouth actually moved. They returned to the townhouse with the genuine portrait just after midnight. Claire should have slept. Instead, she found Luca in the second-floor study, standing alone in front of the painting with a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. The security chair was empty. Progress, Claire said from the doorway. You're finally supervising from a reasonable distance. He glanced at her. I was trying not to breathe on the varnish. She stepped inside. For once, there were no guards in the room, no auction officials, no performance. The fake engagement ring was still on Claire's hand. She had forgotten to remove it. Luca noticed. He said nothing. Claire switched on a narrow fiber-optic light and examined the inside edge of the frame, where the old transfer document had been hidden. Something pale caught between 2 wooden joints. Paper. She worked it free with tweezers. It was folded 4 times, brittle with age. Luca moved closer, but stopped before she told him to. Claire unfolded it beneath the lamp. The handwriting was feminine. Luca recognized it before she did. My mother. The note contained only 3 sentences. James, thank you for protecting what my husband refuses to see. If anything happens to me, GT knows where the records are. Claire's pulse changed. GT. Gabriel Thorne, Luca said. He did not sound surprised. He sounded wounded. Claire looked at him. Your mother trusted my father. Luca stared at the paper. My mother trusted very few people. Did she trust Gabriel? She thought she did. Something in his voice made Claire set down the tweezers. Luca took the chair behind her work table and sat instead of pacing. My father believed loyalty could be purchased, he said. My mother believed that made loyalty meaningless. Claire waited. She kept her own records, names, debts, favors, things my father didn't want written down. And after she died, my father destroyed most of them. Most? I thought all. Claire looked at the note. And my father? Luca's jaw tightened. I remember him. She froze. You said you didn't. I said I didn't know why he was in the photograph. That is not the same thing. No. Claire's anger arrived fast. Luca held her gaze. I was 19. My mother brought him to the house twice. He argued with my father in the library. A week later, your father was arrested. You knew that? I knew a museum employee had been accused of theft. I didn't know his name until you walked into my office. Claire wanted to believe him. That was the problem. You should have told me. Yes. The answer came without defense. Luca looked back at the note. My father taught me that information is only useful if you control when other people receive it. Claire's voice softened despite herself. And how is that working out? His laugh was quiet and humorless. Poorly. For the first time, Luca handed her something without deciding what she was allowed to know first. My mother had a safe deposit account under a foundation name. I found the key after she died. He took a small brass key from his pocket and placed it on the table. I never knew what it opened. Claire turned it over. Stamped into the metal was the old Marlowe Museum crest. The next morning, the mystery began to collapse. Claire cross-referenced the codes from the fake portrait with archived Marlowe inventory ledgers Luca's people obtained from storage. 204, 511, 883. All three belonged to objects moved through temporary holding during the same week her father was accused of theft. But none had actually been stolen. Their paperwork had been altered. Each item had been temporarily assigned to a private insurance trust represented by Gabriel Thorne. Claire stared at the sequence until the pattern became obvious. He wasn't stealing art. Luca stood beside her. Who? Gabriel. She pulled up 20-year-old valuation reports. He was using temporary transfers to move money. Inflated insurance values, private trusts, false custody records. The stolen drawings were camouflage. And your father found it. He worked night security. He saw what moved in and out. Claire's throat tightened. He didn't steal anything. He found the mechanism. Luca said nothing. Claire opened another archived file. James Donnelly's arrest report. The evidence that destroyed him had been approved for internal release by outside counsel. Gabriel Thorne. Claire sat back. 20 years of shame suddenly had a name. Then Luca's security chief entered without knocking. Matteo looked at Claire first. That was wrong. What happened? Luca asked. Matteo placed a tablet on the table. We traced the Calder House leak. On the screen were outgoing encrypted messages from Claire's conservation account, photographs of the hidden initials, ultraviolet scans, the transport code, all sent to an address controlled by Marcus Vale's organization. Claire stopped breathing. That's impossible. Matteo swiped to another screen. Login records, her credentials, her device signature, her apartment network. Someone cloned it. Matteo's expression remained flat. Security says the transmission started before your lab was breached. Claire turned to Luca. He was no longer looking at the evidence. He was looking at her. The room changed. Not visibly, but Claire felt the distance return. "Luca, did you send any image from the portrait outside my network?" "No." "Did you contact Vale?" "No." "Did you know him before last night?" "No." Each answer made his face harder. Claire recognized the transformation. He was not asking because he trusted her. He was building a case. "Don't do this." His voice went quiet. "Until I know what happened, you stay here." Claire stared at him. "What?" "Matteo will secure the house." "You're confining me." "I'm keeping you alive." "No, you're controlling the variable you no longer trust." His silence answered her. The old wound opened with brutal precision. A powerful man deciding guilt before the truth. Her father had lived and died inside that decision. Claire slowly removed the diamond ring. She placed it beside Elena Belandi's note. "Whatever this was becoming," she said, "you just killed it." Something broke behind Luca's eyes, but he did not stop her when Matteo escorted her upstairs. Hours later, alone in the guest room, Claire forced herself to study the copies of the evidence again. The timestamps, the metadata, the photographs. One image showed the initials beneath the black pigment at an angle Claire had never photographed. The depth of field was too shallow for her phone, too narrow for Luca's security cameras. Claire enlarged the reflection in the varnish. A silver barrel. Short macro housing. Scratched red calibration ring. Her missing conservation lens. The one stolen from her temporary lab with the notebook. Claire sat upright. Someone had not leaked her evidence. Someone had manufactured it. Claire did not wait for Luca to believe her. By 4:10 a.m., she had reconstructed the fraud herself. The stolen lens explained the angle. The copied metadata explained the device signature. But the most important detail was something only a conservator would care about. The photograph showed a fiber resting against the wet restoration gel near her father's initials. Bright orange. Synthetic. Claire had seen the same fiber embedded in an archival sleeve inside Gabriel Thorne's private legal storage 20 years earlier, preserved in one of the Marlowe transfer files. He had used the same custom document cases for decades. Claire stared at the image until anger became useful. Then she opened the restoration inventory on the tablet Matteo had left behind. If Gabriel wanted the painting, he believed something was still inside it. So she would give him something to find. Claire created a new conservation report. Most of it was real. One detail was not. She wrote that X-ray imaging had revealed a narrow lead capsule hidden beneath the portrait's lower stretcher bar, containing microfilm too fragile to remove before the Calder auction. Then she saved the report to the same compromised archive and waited. 43 minutes later, someone accessed it. Not from Luca's townhouse. From an encrypted legal office terminal registered to Thorne and Vale Fiduciary Services. Claire smiled without humor. She opened the guest room door. Matteo stood outside. "I need Luca. You're supposed to remain here." "Then remain here while I go prove I'm innocent." Matteo actually looked conflicted. Claire stepped closer. "If Gabriel believes that capsule exists, he is going to Calder House before the morning inventory transfer. If we miss him, your security problem becomes permanent." Matteo swore under his breath. 10 minutes later, Luca entered the room. He looked as if he had not slept. Claire hated that part of her still noticed. "I found the leak." She showed him everything. The lens reflection, the orange fiber, the terminal access, the false report. Luca read silently. "You baited Gabriel." "Yes." without telling me. You can find me. A beat. He accepted that. When will he move? Soon. Luca reached for his phone. Claire stopped him. No raids. No men storming Calder House. If Gabriel sees your security, he runs. What are you proposing? Claire looked directly at him. You trust me. Luca did not answer immediately. That was the entire question. Not whether Gabriel was guilty, not whether Claire's plan would work, whether Luca Bellondi could surrender control long enough to let someone else lead. Finally, he placed the phone on the table. Tell me what to do. At 7:25 a.m., Calder House was nearly empty. The public galleries remained closed while staff prepared for the afternoon sale. The fake Bellondi portrait still hung beneath museum lighting. Claire stood in the conservation room behind the gallery, wearing gloves and a borrowed black dress from the night before. Luca waited behind the service wall with 2 men. No more. That had been Claire's condition. At 7:41, Gabriel Thorne entered through the private legal access corridor. He came alone. Claire watched through the reflection of a darkened monitor as he crossed to the painting. Gabriel did not examine the image. He immediately reached for the lower stretcher bar, exactly where Claire's fake report claimed the capsule was hidden. Claire stepped into the gallery. You won't find it there. Gabriel froze. For half a second, he looked old. Then the practiced attorney returned. Claire, you should have used a different lens. His face changed. Only slightly. Enough. I don't know what you mean. You photographed my father's initials after stealing my equipment. Then you planted the images under my credentials. Gabriel glanced toward the exits. Claire saw the calculation. You framed my father the same way. Silence. Then Gabriel laughed softly. Your father was a sentimental idiot. Claire's chest tightened. Behind the service wall, Luca heard every word through the microphone clipped beneath Claire's collar. He found the transfer scheme, Claire said. He found numbers he did not understand. He understood enough to scare you. Gabriel's expression sharpened. James thought he could expose men who owned judges, police commissioners, museums. He thought truth was protection. And you put stolen art in his car. I gave investigators what they were already prepared to believe. Claire's hands wanted to shake. She did not let them. What did Luca's mother know? Gabriel looked toward the portrait. Too much. That answer landed like ice. Claire took one slow step forward. The records weren't inside this copy. Gabriel's eyes snapped back to her. So where are they? There. The question she needed. Claire smiled. You tell me. Luca stepped from behind the wall. Gabriel reached inside his coat. Luca was faster. He slammed Gabriel against the marble column and ripped the gun from his hand before the older man could clear the holster. For one terrible second, Claire saw exactly what Luca wanted to do. Gabriel saw it too. You think she changes what you are? Gabriel hissed. Your father would have killed me already. Luca pressed the weapon beneath Gabriel's jaw. Claire's voice cut through the gallery. Luca! He did not move. If you kill him, my father stays a thief. Gabriel smiled. Claire continued. He confessed to framing him. He admitted the transfer scheme. He connected Elena to the records. We need him alive. Luca's breathing was slow and heavy. Every instinct written into his body demanded the opposite. Claire stepped closer. Trust me. The weapon lowered. Not because Luca had become merciful, because she asked him to choose truth over control. Matteo moved in and restrained Gabriel. Within hours, the rest followed. The brass key opened a long-forgotten Marlowe Museum deposit drawer, under Elena Belandi's foundation name. Inside were copies of insurance transfers, private trust ledgers, photographs, and James Donnelly's handwritten report documenting Gabriel's operation. Enough to reopen the museum investigation. Enough to clear James publicly. Enough to dismantle the access network Gabriel had used to sell Belandi transport information to Marcus Vale. 3 weeks later, the Marlowe Museum issued a formal correction. James Donnelly had not stolen the drawings. He had attempted to expose the people who did. Claire read the statement twice. Then she folded it and placed it beside the old photograph of her father standing next to Elena Belandi. For the first time in 20 years, she did not feel the need to defend him. The truth could finally stand without her holding it up. Luca ended the engagement rumor himself. No ambiguity, no possessive statement, no claim. When a reporter asked whether Claire Donnelly was still his fiancée, Luca replied simply, "No. Dr. Donnelly makes her own decisions." 4 months later, Claire opened Donnelly Conservation in a renovated brick studio overlooking the river. The Belandi portrait became her first major private restoration. One afternoon, Luca arrived carrying coffee. He stopped beside the completed canvas. His hand lifted automatically toward the frame. Then he remembered. He lowered it. "Where do you want it?" Claire looked at him. At the man who had once entered her laboratory and told her not to touch anything until he gave permission. She pointed to the wall beside her desk. "Right there." Luca placed the portrait exactly where she asked. Claire watched him straighten it. Then she took the coffee from his hand. "And you?" He looked at her. Claire smiled. "You can stay." If you were Claire, could you forgive Luca after he doubted her at the worst possible moment? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you want more stories where trust is more dangerous than any gun.